Hey guys, tonight we drift back, way back, to a time before white noise machines, before weighted blankets, before the very concept of a nightlight. We're talking about the dim, firelit origins of the lullaby itself. Picture this: you're not in a cozy suburban bedroom. You're crouched in the mouth of a cave, or perhaps a simple mud brick hut, and the world outside is not just dark, it's alive with threats you can hear but not see. The yipping of wild dogs, the hoot of an owl, an omen of death. In many cultures, the rustle of something you pray is just the wind. In this world, the night is a terrifyingly active space, and sleep isn't just rest, it's a state of profound vulnerability. Your child's crying isn't an inconvenience, it's a beacon for every predator, real or imagined, within earshot. Your primary job, as a parent in the ancient world, is to silence that cry by any means necessary. You probably wouldn't survive a week in this reality, let alone a night, trying to get a colicky Neolithic baby to sleep without a single modern tool at your disposal. Your voice, a simple rhythm, and a desperate, heartfelt plea into the echoing dark that was the first line of defense. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, while you're at it, drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see this global community of sleepy historians coming together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of the lullaby begins not with a gentle hush, but with a stark, chilling bargain. The earliest lullabies we have any record of are less about sweet dreams, and more about stark reality. They are threats, bribes, and negotiations. Imagine the oldest one we can somewhat decipher, a Sumerian lullaby from nearly 4,000 years ago, etched into a clay tablet that somehow survived the millennia. You're a Babylonian parent, rocking a fussy infant. You don't sing of sheep jumping over fences. You sing of the gods, powerful and petty. The translation is fragmentary, but the gist is a mother trying to reason with the baby, but also with the cosmos. She lists all the things she's done for the child, the hardships she's endured, and then comes the edge, the ancient equivalent of "if you don't go to sleep, I'm going to sell you to the circus." Only this circus is run by demons. The lyrics essentially say, "Please sleep, or the Lulu demon will come down and take you away." Historians still argue whether this was a genuine expression of belief, a culturally accepted form of discipline, or simply the desperate hyperbole of an exhausted parent, a feeling that, I'm sure, is deeply familiar to many of you listening right now, even if your threats involve turning off the Wi-Fi. This was the mainstream function of the ancient lullaby, a protective incantation. Your voice was a spell, weaving a sonic barrier around the child's crib. The rhythm wasn't just to soothe, it was to mimic a steady heartbeat, a reminder of the womb, the only truly safe place the child had ever known. The melody, often repetitive and droning, was designed to hypnotize, to overwhelm the infant's nascent nervous system with a predictable pattern, drowning out the scary, unpredictable noises of the night. You weren't just singing a song, you were performing a ritual of safety, and the threats woven into the lyrics, they weren't considered cruel, they were practical. You were teaching the child, from its earliest moments, the rules of the world. The world is dangerous. Be quiet, be still, and you might be safe. Obey me, and I can protect you. Disobey, and the darkness will take you. It's the ultimate stranger danger talk, set to a gentle, rocking melody. And now for the quirky, fringe tidbit that makes this all so wonderfully weird. While the Mesopotamians were threatening their children with demons, other cultures were getting creative with their ingredients for a good night's sleep. We'll get into the Egyptian specifics later, but let us just say their concept of sleep hygiene involved things that would make a modern doctor recoil in horror. Think less lavender sachet under the pillow, and more, well, more animal dung. The logic wasn't entirely unsound. In a twisted, pre-scientific way, if a smell was potent enough to ward off evil spirits or even just mosquitoes, it was worth a try. So, the lullaby you hummed was only one part of the overall sleep-inducing atmosphere. The air itself was thick with the smoke of specific herbs, the scent of rancid oils, and yes, the distinct aroma of processed crocodile. You were literally trying to sing your baby to sleep in a protective cloud of what can only be described as ancient air freshener, designed not to smell good, but to smell bad to the right entities. It's a stark reminder that our peaceful, sanitized version of bedtime is a very, very recent invention for most of human history. Putting a child to bed was an act of defiance against the chaos of the universe, a small, whispered rebellion against the dark, sung in a minor key and accompanied by the faint smell of reptile excrement. The hum of the Nile is your new soundtrack, a low, constant drone beneath the chorus of frogs and distant hippopotami. The air is thick and hot, even hours after the sun has vanished, carrying the scent of baking mud, lotus blossoms, and something else, something musky and animalic. You're no longer in the stark terror of Mesopotamia. You're in a reed-lined dwelling in Thebes, circa 1500 BCE, and the atmosphere is less about outright terror and more about layered protection. Here, the lullaby isn't just a threat or a bargain. It's a complex spell, a verbal amulet. The mother, or perhaps a hired nurse, cradles the infant not just in her arms, but in a web of words so potent they are believed to have tangible power. You can feel the rhythm of her rocking, a slow, deliberate motion since to the meter of her chant. This isn't just singing, it's a ritual, and every syllable is chosen not for its melodic quality, but for its apotropaic potency, its ability to ward off evil. The mainstream historical fact we cling to here comes from the fragments of papyrus and Astraka broken pottery shards used as scrap paper that have survived Egypt's dry climate. These texts reveal lullabies that are direct invocations to the gods. You're not just asking the child to sleep, you're calling upon Bees, the grotesque yet beloved dwarf god of the household and protector of children, whose grimacing face is carved into the headboard of the very crib. You're whispering prayers to Hathor, the goddess of motherhood and joy, asking for her benevolent milk to soothe the fussy infant. The lyrics might describe the child as being under the direct protection of Horus or Isis, a divine endorsement meant to scare off any lesser, malevolent spirits lurking in the shadows. The lullaby is a legal document, in a way, filed with the cosmic bureaucracy, stating clearly that this child is claimed by the big leagues of the Egyptian pantheon and is, therefore, off limits. But the words are only half the story. This is where we drift into the wonderfully quirky, fringe territory of practical Egyptian sleep science. Remember that faint, musky smell on the air? Let's just say the ancient Egyptians were profoundly pragmatic, and their approach to childcare involved a lot of things that would make a modern parent call social services. While the mother sings her protective incantation, a paste might be drying on the baby's forehead. Its ingredients, a mixture of herbs, honey, and yes, occasionally, crocodile dung. Now, before you recoil completely, let's apply their logic. The crocodile was Sobek, a powerful and feared god. Using his waste was a form of sympathetic magic. It was like putting up a sign that said Sobek was here, a potent deterrent to any lesser evil spirit thinking of causing trouble. It was the olfactory equivalent of a security system sticker on a window. It smelled bad, therefore it must be powerful. Historians still argue whether these practices were purely superstitious, or had some unintended practical benefits. Perhaps the ammonia in the dung helped repel insects, making the baby's sleep genuinely less disturbed by bites, thus proving effective through entirely different means than intended. It was a multi-sensory assault on the forces of darkness, a soothing sound for the baby, a threatening spell for the demons, and a truly offensive smell for everyone else. You have to understand the Egyptian worldview to get it. For them, the line between the physical and the spiritual was incredibly thin. A headache wasn't just a biological event, it was the work of a minor demon. A baby's cry wasn't just hunger, it was a sign of spiritual distress. Therefore, the solution had to operate on both planes simultaneously. The lullaby was the spiritual technology, the verbal medicine, but it required a physical component to anchor it, hence the pastes. The amulets of blue faience meant to mimic the protective eye of Horus, the headrests carved with protective deities. The child was being swaddled in layers of security, both seen and unseen. You're not just listening to a song, you're witnessing an ancient and holistic security protocol. The mother's voice is calm, steady, a rock in the spiritual river, all while her hands might be applying something truly foul-smelling. It is this bizarre dichotomy that defines the era, the sublime and the grotesque working in tandem to achieve a single desperate goal, a few hours of quiet, peaceful sleep. For a child in a world teeming with unseen dangers, the air changes. The thick, mystical humidity of the Nile Delta evaporates, replaced by the dry, clear heat of the Aegean sun and the scent of olive groves and saltwater. The setting shifts from a dim, smoky hut to a colonnaded courtyard, a peristyle, where the logic of geometry and philosophy orders the world. You've left the realm of incantations and protective dung pastes behind. You're in classical Greece, and here, the problem of a crying infant is not a spiritual crisis to be solved with magic, but a logistical one to be solved with reason. The lullaby is undergoing a massive upgrade, moving from the domain of the priestess to the notebook of the philosopher. It's being systematized. The Greeks looked at the chaotic, fear-based traditions of their neighbors and their own ancestors and asked, yes, but what is the rational way to get a baby to sleep? This is where we get our mainstream historical bedrock, courtesy of guys like Aristotle. In his Politics and other texts, the great philosopher himself dispenses child-rearing advice with the same confident, systematic approach he'd used to analyze the constitution of a city-state. For the Greeks, especially in Athens, the goal wasn't just a quiet child. It was the creation of a well-balanced future citizen. Aristotle recommended that infants be kept in a state of almost constant motion, arguing that the silence they experienced in the womb had accustomed them to movement. He suggested rocking them in cradles, carrying them about, even employing swings. The lullaby, in this context, becomes the auditory component of this constant kinetic therapy. Its rhythm is meant to substitute for the physical motion, a metronome for the body and mind. The content of the songs was also being subtly shaped. While old myths and stories were still used, the underlying purpose was often pedagogical, seeding the values of the polis, courage, wisdom, duty into the child's earliest memories. You're not being sung to about demons, you're being subtly programmed for citizenship. But for a truly quirky, fringe tidbit, we have to look at the practical, on-the-ground reality that often contradicted the high-minded philosophizing. While Aristotle was writing treatises on ideal upbringing, the average Greek parent, and especially the nurses and nannies who did the actual round-the-clock childcare, had a more direct solution. Wine, specifically, wine-soaked rags, the practice of giving infants wine, or pacifying them by letting them suck on a cloth soaked in wine and honey, was apparently widespread enough that serious medical texts of the era, like those attributed to Hippocrates, felt the need to warn against it. They rightly observed that it could lead to convulsions and was bad for the nerves. But the appeal is obvious. It worked. A slightly tipsy baby is a sleepy baby. It is a stark reminder that the gap between intellectual theory and exhausted parental practice is a chasm as old as time itself. So picture the scene: a nurse, perhaps having heard a watered-down version of Aristotelian ideas about motion, rocks the cradle with one foot while humming an old tune about Hercules, all the while gently dabbing a wine-soaked linen cloth to the gums of her tiny, soon-to-be snoozing charge. Philosophy meets pragmatism in the most literal sense. Historians still argue whether this more rational approach represented a genuine decrease in superstition or merely a change in its packaging. The Greeks were famously superstitious. They believed in omens, curses, and capricious gods just as much as anyone. So, was the lullaby truly stripped of its protective power? Or did the Greek parent simply believe that the rhythm itself, now endorsed by a great thinker like Aristotle, held a new kind of power, the power of logos, of reason? By applying a logical system to sleep, they may have felt they were appealing to a higher, more orderly form of protection than the scare tactics of old. It was a different kind of magic, one dressed in the robes of a philosopher rather than the feathers of a shaman. The goal was the same: to impose order on the chaos of the night and the vulnerability of infancy. They just built a better, more logical mousetrap. Even if they occasionally baited it with a little diluted vintage, the air turns heavier, more formal. The easygoing Greek rationality hardens into something more severe, more purposeful. You're in the atrium of a Roman domus, the heart of a wealthy household. The sounds are different here. The clipped, precise cadence of Latin, the melodic flow of Greek, the heavy tread of military boots on mosaic floors, the authoritative rustle of scrolls. The Roman world is one of order, discipline, and destiny. And from the moment a child is born, especially a son, he is a project. He is not just a baby, he is a future citizen, a soldier, a statesman for the empire. His childhood is not a time of sheltered innocence, but a boot camp for life. And the lullaby, in this context, is conscripted into service. It becomes less a source of comfort and more a tool for early indoctrination, a nightly drip feed of Roman values. The mainstream historical fact we anchor to is the Roman concept of pietas, a deep, all-encompassing sense of duty to the gods, the state, and one's family. This wasn't a suggestion, it was the bedrock of their identity, and this instruction began at the cradle. Roman lullabies, as inferred from later writings and the few fragments we have, were often little lessons set to a simple rhythm. You wouldn't sing of random, fanciful things. You would sing of the heroic deeds of Annius, the pious founder of Rome. You would hum tunes that incorporated the names of great consuls and generals. The rhythm itself was often compared to the steady, marching beat of a legion's pace: sin, dex, sin left, left, right, left. The child was being swaddled in sound, not just in cloth, conditioned to find comfort in the very rhythms that would one day march him to the edges of the known world. The voice singing to him was likely that of a wet nurse or a pedagogess, a slave tasked with early education, chosen for her clear diction and moral character, because every interaction was a lesson. But for our wonderfully quirky, fringe element, we have to talk about the Roman obsession with pragmatism taken to its extreme. While the Greeks might have dabbed a little wine on the gums, the Romans had a more potent and terrifying tool in their arsenal: papaversum poppy syrup. The opium poppy was a common garden plant in Rome, and its use as a sedative was widely documented by physicians like Galen. It was a common, albeit dangerous, practice for a nurse to quiet a fussy infant by administering a few drops of this powerful narcotic. The line between a soothing dose and a lethal one was terrifyingly thin. There are accounts, perhaps exaggerated but rooted in truth, of nurses overdosing their charges, either by accident or, in some dark tales, on purpose to secure an easier night for themselves. So imagine the scene. A stern pedagogist might be reciting the 12 tables of Roman law in a gentle rhythmic monotone, while the wet nurse is subtly administering a few drops of a powerful hypnotic into the baby's milk. It was chemical warfare on wakefulness, a pharmacological shortcut to the ideal of the quiet, compliant Roman child. The lullaby was the psychological conditioning. The poppy syrup was the brute force enforcement. Historians still argue whether the pervasive use of wet nurses and pedagogy created an emotional distance in Roman upper-class families, making the lullaby a cold, transactional tool rather than an expression of maternal love. Was a child sung to sleep by a paid servant with a measured dose of opium in its system receiving care, or was it merely being processed? The Romans themselves wrote extensively about the importance of the mother's role, but their actions often told a different story. The lullaby, in this light, becomes a symbol of that contradiction. It was a performance of duty, a checkmark on the list of proper upbringing, but it often lacked the raw, desperate, personal emotion of the Babylonian mother threatening demons or the Egyptian mother weaving spells. It was efficient, it was practical, it served the needs of the state, and in the relentless engine of the Roman Empire, that was often what mattered most. The stone walls of the Roman villa crumble away, the orderly mosaics cracking and being swallowed by weeds. The world contracts, grows darker, denser. The air you breathe now is thick with wood smoke and the damp, earthy smell of a thatched roof. You're in a one-room longhouse in Saxon England, or perhaps a wattleland daub hut in Frankish Gaul. The grand, imperial confidence of Rome is a faded memory, replaced by a pervasive, gnawing uncertainty. The night outside isn't just dark, it is occupied. The forests are deep and endless, and they are full of things that do not love you. This is the medieval mind, and its relationship with the dark was fundamentally adversarial. The lullaby, in this context, reverts from a tool of state indoctrination back to its ancient role, a protective ward. But the threats have multiplied and taken on specific, chilling forms. You're not just singing a child to sleep. You are standing sentry against a fully populated supernatural world. The mainstream historical fact that anchors us here is the sheer ubiquity of supernatural belief in daily medieval life. This wasn't the abstract faith of a cathedral. This was the immediate, practical fear of the hearth, demons, ghosts, and most of all, fairies, the fair folk. The good neighbor's names spoken softly so as not to offend were considered real, present, and actively malicious. The lullabies from this period, many of which evolved into the nursery rhymes we know today, are riddled with these references. Rockabye Baby on its surface is about a cradle in a tree, but its subtext is a terrifyingly common fear that a fairy might swoop in and swap a healthy, human baby for a sickly, changeling fairy child. The song isn't a gentle narrative, it's a sympathetic magic ritual, describing the feared event to somehow magically avert it. You sing of the cradle falling so that it never actually falls. You name the danger to disarm it. And this brings us to our wonderfully quirky, fringe tidbit, the specific bedtime rituals that accompany these lullabies. The singing was crucial, but it was only one part of a complex nightly security system. Before a child was even laid down, the mother might have woven crosses from rushes and tucked them into the crib's bedding. Iron, such as a cold knife or a pair of shears, was placed beneath the cradle, as fairies were said to have an aversion to the metal. The hearth was carefully banked for the night, but a single lit candle was often left burning, a small, defiant light against the overwhelming dark, and the lullaby itself was the final, auditory lock on the door. You weren't just singing "Hush, little baby," you were singing a specific, coded instruction to the supernatural world. A lullaby like Lavender's Blue isn't just a sweet song. Its repetitive, almost hypnotic structure was designed to create a sonic barrier. The lyrics, often nonsensical to our modern ears, were believed to contain old, powerful words of protection. You were building a fortress of sound around the child's crib. Historians still argue whether the pervasive fear of fairies and changelings was a genuine cultural belief or a folkloric explanation for very real and tragically common medieval tragedies. Infant mortality was devastatingly high. A baby might be perfectly healthy at sunset and dead of unknown causes by sunrise. Illnesses, birth defects, failure to thrive. How does a parent in a pre-scientific age process such a loss? The concept of the changeling offered a brutal, heartbreaking kind of comfort. It wasn't that your beautiful, perfect child had died. It was that the cunning, cruel fairies had stolen him and left this wasting, crying imposter in his place. The lullaby, then, becomes even more poignant. It wasn't just a protection spell. It was a nightly battle to keep your real child from being taken. Every night you sang was a night you won. The exhaustion in the mother's voice isn't just from a long day of labor. It is from the immense spiritual weight of being the sole line of defense between her child and a world teeming with invisible predators. She sings, her voice hoarse with weariness, as much to convince herself as to soothe the baby, building her fortress of rhyme one shaky, desperate brick at a time. The cramped, smoky confines of the medieval longhouse dissolve, its oppressive atmosphere lifting as if carried away on a great wind. Your perspective doesn't just shift geographically, it pulls back, soaring upwards until you're looking down on the entire, spinning globe. Below you, isolated by impassable mountain ranges, vast oceans, and trackless deserts, distinct human cultures have flourished in complete ignorance of one another. And yet, as you listen, a faint, familiar pattern begins to emerge from the planetary static. A hum, a rhythm, a melody. It's the same everywhere, from the icy vastness of the Arctic to the dense humidity of the African rainforest, from the nomadic steppes of Asia to the islands of the South Pacific. The human species is singing its children to sleep using the same basic musical toolkit. You are witnessing a universal human technology, developed independently across the planet. The lullaby isn't a cultural artifact, it's a biological imperative. The mainstream historical, or rather, anthropological fact that grounds this section is the documented study of these universal patterns. Ethnomusicologists who have recorded and analyzed lullabies from hundreds of disparate cultures find startling commonalities. The songs are almost always slow in tempo, matching the average resting heart rate. They are repetitive, using simple, cyclical melodies that don't surprise or excite the infant's nervous system. Crucially, the vocal tone used by the singer is consistent globally, a softer, breathier, higher-pitched voice than normal speech, often called motherese or infant-directed speech. This isn't a cultural affectation, it's a hardwired response. Studies have shown infants consistently prefer these vocal modifications, which seem to be designed to maximize their attention and calm them. The content of the lyrics varies wildly, from Mongolian songs about grazing horses to Polynesian songs about ocean waves. But the musical structure is virtually identical. It is one of the most profound examples of convergent cultural evolution we have. But for our quirky, fringe element, let us zoom in on one of the most extreme and beautiful examples, the lullabies of the Tuvan throat singers in Siberia. In this nomadic culture, famous for their incredible ability to sing multiple notes simultaneously, the lullaby takes on a unique, physical dimension. A Tuvan mother might use a technique called kome to create a deep, fundamental drone that vibrates in her chest, a sound the baby would have felt constantly in the womb. Over the top of this, she might sing a soft, melodic line. The effect is a living, breathing piece of audio architecture built around the child, a low, vibrational floor with a gentle melodic ceiling. It's a lullaby you don't just hear, you feel it in your bones. It's a sonic swaddle, leveraging the physics of sound to achieve its goal. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a Yoruba mother in Nigeria might be singing a lullaby, with a complex polyrhythmic structure that mimics the patterns of spoken language, subtly preparing the child's ear for the intricate tonal qualities of their native tongue. The methods are culturally specific, but the goal is universally human. Historians and anthropologists still argue whether these universal patterns point to a single, ancient origin of the lullaby that spread with early human migrations, or if they represent a spontaneous independent invention born from the identical physiological and psychological needs of caregivers and infants everywhere. Is the lullaby a meme passed down from a common ancestor, Or is it simply what happens when a human, any human, tries to soothe another human using the only instrument they are born with? The evidence leans heavily toward the latter. The lullaby appears to be a brilliant, innate hack of our own biology. The slow rhythm regulates the infant's heartbeat and breathing. The high pitch cuts through low-frequency background noise, grabbing the baby's attention. The repetition is predictable and therefore safe. You are not learning a cultural tradition when you sing to a baby. You are following a deep, instinctual script written into our very species. You are participating in a ritual as old as humanity itself, a soft, gentle thread that connects a mother in Mumbai, a father in Montreal, and a grandmother in Mongolia, all performing the same ancient vital magic trick, spinning sound into sleep. The global hum of 1,000 different lullabies is suddenly overwhelmed by a new, mechanical sound, the rhythmic, percussive thunk-thunk-thunk of a printing press. The scene snaps from the vast, open landscapes of human instinct to the close, inky, and profoundly smelly confines of a 16th century printer's workshop in London or Mainz. The air, once filled with the unique variations of a mother's personal melody, now carries the scent of lamb-black oil and damp paper. This is a revolution, and it's about to standardize sleep. The invention of movable type didn't just change how we spread news or religion, it fundamentally altered the intimate, oral tradition of the lullaby, transforming it from a fluid, personal ritual into a fixed, mass-produced product. You are witnessing the moment the lullaby becomes a commodity. The mainstream historical fact here is the rise of the broadside ballad. These were large, single sheets of paper, printed cheaply on one side, often featuring a popular song, a sensational news story, or a political satire. They were the tabloids and pop singles of the early modern world, sold for a penny on street corners and pinned up in taverns and homes, and among them were lullabies. For the first time, a mother didn't have to rely solely on what her own mother had sung to her. She could buy a sheet with the lyrics to a popular nurse's song, often set to a well-known tune. This was the beginning of a cultural homogenization. A lullaby sung in a Scottish fishing village could now be the exact same one sung in a bustling London tenement. The printing press was creating a shared, national soundtrack for childhood, for better or worse. But here's the wonderfully quirky, fringe part. The content of these mass-produced lullabies was often shockingly, hilariously grim. The oral tradition had its dark edges, sure, but the printed broadsides seemed to revel in it. We're not just talking about vague fairy threats. We're talking about specific, modern, and often brutally satirical horrors. One famous example, The Cries of London, set to a lulling tune, essentially serenaded the child with a catalogue of urban misery, the shouts of beggars, chimney sweeps, and rat-catchers. It was less hush little baby and more go to sleep or you'll end up like that poor sod selling matches in the rain. The most infamous collection is the 1744 Tommy Thumb's Pretty Songbook, the first known anthology of nursery rhymes, which includes the original, horrifying version of Rockabye Baby, where the cradle and the baby actually fall. These weren't sanitized children's songs. They were reflections of a harsh, cynical, and often violent world, now set to a jaunty, memorable rhythm for easy infant consumption. Sleep wasn't an escape from the world. It was a temporary respite that the world was constantly invading. Historians still argue whether the printing press democratized the lullaby or simply commercialized and cheapened it. On one hand, it gave everyone access to a wider repertoire. On the other, it began to strip the lullaby of its personal, protective magic. A bought song on a piece of paper doesn't carry the same weight as a melody passed down through generations, infused with the specific love and fears of a family line. It became more about entertainment and less about ritual. The mother was no longer a shaman casting a spell. She was a consumer, reading from a script written by an anonymous, probably male, printer who was more interested in a quick profit than a child's spiritual well-being. The lullaby was being divorced from its primal roots and dressed up in cheap ink and cynical verse, ready for sale. The gentle, ancient hum of humanity was being drowned out by the relentless, commercial thud of the press. The smell of cheap ink and the rhythmic thud of the printing press fade, replaced by a new, unsettling sensation, the slow, nauseating roll of a ship on a vast, endless ocean. The air is thick with the smell of salt, unwashed bodies, and the profound, aching scent of homesickness. You are in the cramped, dark hold of a ship during the age of exploration, or perhaps in a sparse, makeshift cabin on the edge of a vast, unfamiliar continent. This is the colonial experience, and it fundamentally reshapes the song of the cradle. Here, the The lullaby is no longer just about protecting a child from the dark. It's about preserving a memory of a home they will never know, a culture straining to survive in an alien landscape. The lullaby becomes an anchor, a tiny, sonic life raft in a sea of displacement. The mainstream historical fact we cling to is the role of the lullaby as a primary vehicle for cultural memory among displaced peoples. For colonists, whether voluntary or forced, the songs they sang to their children were among the few possessions they could carry that no one could take from them. An English settler in the brutal cold of New England would sing the same old broadside ballads their grandmother knew, but now the lyrics about England as green and pleasant land would be imbued with a painful visceral longing. The lullaby became an act of defiance, a daily reinforcement of identity. For enslaved Africans on the plantations of the American South, this was magnified 1,000-fold. Their lullabies were among the most powerful tools for cultural survival. They would sing in their native languages, or weave African words and rhythms into English lyrics, creating a coded sonic world their oppressors couldn't fully understand. The lullaby was a secret garden, a place where a stolen identity could be nurtured and passed on, one sleepy child at a time. But for our quirky, fringe tidbit, we have to look at the strange, unintended fusions that occurred at these cultural crossroads. Imagine a Celtic mother from the Scottish Highlands, now living in the Appalachian Mountains, singing a mournful Gaelic lullaby to her child. The melody is ancient, but outside her window, the sounds of the forest are entirely new. The call of a whippoorwill, the cry of a bobcat. Over time, these new sounds might subtly influence the old melody, bending a note here, adding a pause there. The lyrics, too, might shift. The bogeyman of the Scottish moors might slowly transform into a new, local terror based on Cherokee legends she'd heard whispered by neighbors. The lullaby became a living document of cultural collision and adaptation. It was no longer purely Scottish or purely American. It was something new, a hybrid born of profound loneliness and the raw human need to make a new place feel like home, even just for the duration of a song. Historians still argue whether these transplanted lullabies served more as a comforting connection to the past or as a painful reminder of a loss that could never be recovered. Was a mother singing of the lavender fields of Provence to a child born in the dusty plains of Texas, providing comfort or perpetuating a kind of melancholy? The lullaby, in this context, is deeply bittersweet. It is an act of love, but it is also an act of grief. The singer is mourning a world gone forever, even as they try to build a new one for the child in their arms. The voice is soft and soothing, but if you listen closely, beneath the melody, you can hear the quiet, relentless undercurrent of the diaspora, the sound of a heart stretched across an ocean, beating into different times at once. The song is a bridge, but it's a bridge that leads back to a shore that has long since eroded away, making the gentle rocking of the cradle feel more like the rocking of a ship on a sea of memory, forever moving, but never quite arriving. The vast, lonely quiet of the colonial frontier is violently shattered. The gentle rocking of a ship at sea becomes the relentless, jolting shake of a loom. The scent of clean, open air is choked out by the thick, greasy smog of coal fire and machine oil. You are in a cramped terraced house in Manchester or Pittsburgh, pressed up against the window of a childless room that looks out not onto fields or forests, but onto the soot-blackened brick wall of another identical house. The sun is gone, blotted out by industry, and the night is now defined by its absence, a brief, precious interval of silence in a world that screams and clatters without ceasing. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change where people worked, it invaded the sanctity of the home and rewired the very concept of rest. And the lullaby, that ancient tool of comfort, was forced to adapt, its gentle rhythms now competing with the monstrous, mechanical heartbeat of the new age. The mainstream historical fact here is the brutal reality of factory labor and its effect on family life. With both parents often working 12 to 16-hour shifts, the actual act of singing a child to sleep frequently fell to an older sibling, perhaps a child of only 6 or 7 themselves, or an elderly relative too worn out to work. The lullaby became a duty, a chore, sung by someone who was themselves exhausted to the point of collapse. The content of the songs reflected this new, grim reality. The old folk tales of fairies and heroes felt distant and irrelevant. Instead, the lullabies began to incorporate the sounds of the new world. The gentle rockabye rhythm might now subconsciously mimic the pounding of a steam hammer or the rhythmic clatter of the jacquard loom. There are documented lullabies from Lancashire mill towns that literally include lyrics about the big wheel turning or the shuttle flying. transforming the instruments of daily oppression into a bizarre, hypnotic sleep aid. The machine wasn't just outside the window, it was inside the melody, its pulse dictating the pace of rest. But for our wonderfully quirky, fringe element, we have to talk about the ultimate symbol of industrial sleep, the factory whistle. In mill towns, life was governed by the whistle. It told you when to wake, when to work, when to eat, and when to finally go home. Its piercing shriek was the sound of authority, of capital, of own time, and it became the most hated and, ironically, the most relied upon sound in a parent's life. For a mother trying to get a child to sleep before her own exhausted collapse, the schedule was everything. She would calculate the hours until the next whistle blew. The lullaby itself became a race against time, a desperate attempt to force sleep into a narrow window of opportunity between the end of one shift and the beginning of the next. There are accounts of mothers developing a specific, rapid-fire singing style, a musical efficiency drive meant to achieve maximum soporific effect in minimum minutes. The lullaby was being tailorized, optimized for industrial output. The goal was no longer a peaceful, natural descent into sleep. It was a managed, scheduled shutdown of a tiny human system, because the larger system demanded it. Historians still argue whether these industrial-era lullabies represent a form of tragic assimilation where the human spirit simply gave up and accepted the machine's rhythm as its own, or a subtle, profound act of resistance. Is singing your child to sleep with a song about the very mill that is starving you of light and time and acceptance of that reality? Or is it an act of reclamation, by taking the sound of the oppressor, the clatter, the rhythm, the whistle, and weaving it into a song of love and comfort? Were these parents performing a kind of alchemy? Were they transforming the symbol of their exhaustion into a tool of tenderness, thereby robbing it of some of its power? The baby, after all, doesn't know the loom is a monster. It only knows the sound of its mother's voice, weaving that harsh, mechanical noise into something soft, something safe. The lullaby becomes a filter, trying desperately to strain the love out of the industrial noise, a quiet act of defiance sung in the dark by people who had no other way to fight back. The soot-stained twilight of the industrial city dissolves, the cacophony of the factory floor receding like a bad dream. The setting shifts to a different kind of interior, a well-appointed, book-lined study in early 20th century Vienna. The air smells of leather, cigar smoke, and a new, potent scent. Antiseptic ambition. The palpable, physical exhaustion of the mill worker is replaced by a different kind of fatigue, a pervasive, buzzing, psychological weariness. You have entered the age of analysis, and the simple, ancient act of singing a child to sleep is no longer just a ritual or a comfort. It is a symptom. The lullaby is being taken from the hands of mothers and placed on the couch of a bearded, intensely serious man named Sigmund Freud. It is about to be diagnosed. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this section is the seismic impact of Freudian psychoanalysis on the Western perception of childhood and, by extension, everything related to it. Freud's theories, particularly around the Oedipus complex and the formative power of early childhood experiences, turned the nursery into a minefield of potential neuroses. The lullaby, in this new light, wasn't a harmless melody. It was a rich text for interpretation, dripping with latent meaning. Psychoanalysts began to dissect traditional lullabies with the same fervor they applied to dreams. That simple, threatening line in Rockabye Baby about the cradle falling, obviously a manifestation of castration anxiety. The frequent appearance of animals, cows jumping over moons, spiders scaring away girls, became symbolic representations of primal fears and desires. The act of the mother singing, of her voice being the last thing the child hears before surrendering to the vulnerable state of sleep, was reframed as a complex negotiation of attachment and separation anxiety. The lullaby was no longer a song, it was a therapy session in miniature. But for our wonderfully quirky, fringe tidbit, we have to look at the practical, and often absurd, application of these theories, as Freud's ideas trickled down into popular parenting advice via books and magazines. They created a new kind of anxiety, the anxiety of causing anxiety. Mothers were now instructed to not just sing, but to monitor what they sang and how they sang it. Was their tone too ambivalent? Did a song about a baby falling from a tree subconsciously communicate a death wish toward the child? This led to some truly bizarre attempts to sanitize the lullaby repertoire. Publishers began releasing books of approved lullabies that were scrubbed clean of any dark or Freudian undertones, resulting in songs so bland and saccharine they were practically anesthetic. The pressure was immense. A woman could now feel she was psychologically damaging her child by absent-mindedly humming an old folk tune her own grandmother had sung. The lullaby had become a minefield, and every mother was a nervous bomb disposal expert, tiptoeing through the nursery, terrified of triggering an Oedipal complex before lights out. Historians still argue whether the psychoanalytic lens provided a valuable, deeper understanding of these cultural artifacts, or simply represented a new form of intellectual colonization, where male academics pathologized the intimate, intuitive practices of women. Did Freud uncover the hidden truths of the lullaby, or did he simply project his own theories onto them, creating meaning where there was none? The lullaby, after all, predates Vienna by several millennia. Its power likely resides in its simplicity and its ancient, biological roots, not in its ability to symbolize penis envy. The act of overanalyzing it, of dragging its simple, rhythmic magic into the harsh light of the psychiatrist's lamp, might have been the most unsoothing thing we ever did to it. It took a universal gesture of comfort and turned it into a problem to be solved, replacing the gentle, sleepy magic of the nursery with the dry, anxious click of the analyst's clock. The hushed, anxious atmosphere of the analyst's study is abruptly pierced by a new sound, the electric crackle of a vacuum tube warming up, followed by the faint, ghostly strains of a melody emerging from a fabric-covered speaker grill. The scent of cigar, smoke and leather is replaced by the smell of warm wood veneer and hot electronics. You are in a suburban living room in the 1930s or 40s, and the voice singing the child to sleep is no longer emanating from a person in the room. It's a phantom voice, broadcast through the air, captured by a wire aerial strung along the roof, and conjured into being by the family's newest and most magical piece of furniture, the radio. The intimate, millennia-old dyad of parent and child has been interrupted. A third, invisible party has entered the nursery, and the lullaby will never be the same. The mainstream historical fact here is the rise of mass media as a surrogate caregiver. The radio, and later the phonograph, offered something unprecedented, a perfectly consistent, infinitely patient, and professionally performed lullaby. No matter how tired a parent was, they could now turn a dial and have a smooth, melodic baritone or a sweet, crystalline soprano take over the duty of soothing. Children's programming blocks became a staple of radio schedules, with segments specifically dedicated to bedtime hour, hosted by avuncular voices who would tell gentle stories and sing slow, calming songs for exhausted parents. This was a miracle. It was also the first major step in the outsourcing of intimacy. The lullaby, once a deeply personal transaction between caregiver and child, was becoming a standardized product consumed by a mass audience. The singer didn't know your name, didn't know your fears, and couldn't adjust the rhythm to your child's specific breathing. It was one-size-fits-all, comfort, delivered electronically. But for our quirky, fringe tidbit, we have to talk about the unintended psychological effects of this new, disembodied voice. Imagine a child in this era, drifting off to sleep not to the familiar, slightly off-key humming of their mother, but to the flawless, resonant tones of a professional radio announcer. That voice was a paradox. It was intimate, coming from right there in the room, yet it was also profoundly impersonal. It was a voice without a face, without a body, without a history. It could be soothing, but it could also be strangely alienating. There are accounts from the time of children forming intense, parasocial attachments to these radio voices, confusing them with real relationships. Furthermore, the content of these radio lullabies was heavily commercialized and sanitized. The dark, folkloric edges of the old songs were filed smooth to avoid offending sponsors or worrying parents. The lullaby was being neutered, transformed from a potent, ancient spell into a harmless, auditory sleeping pill designed to sell soap flakes and breakfast cereal. Historians still argue whether the electronic broadcast of lullabies represented a democratization of comfort, making a high standard of musical soothing available to all, regardless of their own singing ability, or the beginning of a profound alienation in the parent-child relationship. Was it a helpful tool, or was it the first thread pulled from the intricate tapestry of intimate care? The radio didn't just provide a song. It implicitly passed judgment. It set a new standard. A mother's own, imperfect singing voice might now be compared, unfavorably, to the rich, trained voice coming from the Stromberg Carlson console in the corner. The act of singing to your child could suddenly feel amateurish, inadequate. The technology, meant to assist, sometimes ended up intimidating, creating a new kind of anxiety where before there had only been the simple, unself-conscious act of a parent trying to calm their child. The electronic lullaby was a benevolent ghost in the nursery, a helpful spirit that could also, subtly, haunt the confidence of the very person it was meant to help. The warm, woody glow of the radio dial is replaced by the sterile, blue-white light of a computer screen. The crackle and hiss of the analog broadcast are gone, supplanted by the silent, perfect fidelity of a digital stream. The room is no longer a mid-century living room, but a modern nursery, where a sleek Wi-Fi speaker sits where a stuffed animal might have. The voice singing the lullaby is not a parent, not a radio host, not even a human. It is an algorithm. You have arrived in the present day, where the ancient, intuitive art of the lullaby has been dissected, quantified, and repackaged as a product. Sleep is no longer a natural state to be gently invited. It is a biological problem to be efficiently solved, and a multi-billion-dollar industry has emerged to sell you the solution. The mainstream historical fact here is the rise of the corporate lullaby album and the scientific sleep aid industry. This isn't your parents' cassette tape of folk songs. This is a meticulously engineered audio product, often created by teams of sound designers, neuroscientists, and marketing experts. Albums with names like Baby Sleep Miracle or The Mozart Effect for Babies flood online marketplaces, promising proven results. They utilize specific frequency ranges like delta waves or binaural beats, which are claimed to directly entrain the brain into a state of sleep. The music is often intentionally bland, avoiding melodic complexity or lyrical depth that might stimulate the child's brain. Instead of soothing it, the lullaby has been stripped of its cultural baggage, its folklore, its emotion, and reduced to a set of acoustic parameters designed for maximum efficiency. It is comfort, optimized for scale and profit. But for our wonderfully quirky, fringe tidbit, let's peek into the labs where this audio engineering happens. The quest for the perfect, scientifically backed lullaby has led to some bizarre experiments. Researchers hook infants up to EEG machines to measure their brainwave responses to different sonic patterns. They test the soporific effects of a pure 432 Hz tone versus a 528 Hz healing frequency. They create endlessly looping tracks of white noise, pink noise, and brown noise, analyzing which one makes a baby drift off fastest. There are now playlists on streaming services algorithmically generated to match the precise gestational age of a newborn, adjusting the BPM and frequency content week by week as the infant's nervous system develops. The most extreme end of this is the development of smart sleepers bassinets that automatically rock and play algorithmically generated lullabies in response to a baby's cry, detected by an internal microphone. The parent is entirely removed from the loop. The ancient ritual has become a closed feedback system between infant and machine, a perfectly calibrated service with a monthly subscription fee. Historians still argue whether this hyperscientific, corporate approach represents the ultimate evolution of the lullaby, a final, triumphant victory over the superstition and inconsistency of the past, or its final, tragic impoverishment. What is lost when the voice that sings a child to sleep has no history, no love, no fear, and no soul? The algorithm doesn't care. It simply executes its code. The lullaby was once a transaction of love and vulnerability, a shared moment of humanity between caregiver and child in the face of a terrifying universe. Now, it risks becoming a transaction of data and convenience, a product consumed to solve a problem. The parent, bombarded with marketing that preys on their exhaustion and anxiety, can feel that their own imperfect voice is insufficient compared to the scientifically validated soundtrack. They outsource the lullaby, and in doing so, they outsource a piece of that primal, intimate connection. The child falls asleep to the sound of perfect, flawless, empty code, and the ancient, magical hum of the human voice is silenced not by the dark, but by the relentless, efficient logic of the market. The clinical, algorithmic nursery fades, its sterile walls dissolving into the ultimate, airless black. The gentle hum of a Wi-Fi speaker is replaced by a far deeper, more profound silence, the silence of the void. You are no longer on Earth. You are strapped into a couch aboard the International Space Station, watching a sunrise that happens 16 times a day, or you are crammed into the tiny cabin of a spacecraft bound for Mars. The ancient, earthbound fears that gave birth to the lullaby, the predators in the dark, the capricious fairies, the terrors of the unknown, are now incomprehensibly distant. But a new, even more profound vulnerability has taken their place, the absolute fragility of a living organism, in the cosmic deep, and here, in the most hostile environment humanity has ever known. The lullaby has not been abandoned. It has been launched into the future. The mainstream historical fact that grounds this section is the very real, Practical use of music and rhythmic sound in space agencies like NASA and Roscosmos, astronauts, the most highly trained and rational individuals on the planet, routinely use music as a tool for psychological regulation. The constant hum of life support systems provides a modern, mechanical version of the ancient drone, a predictable sonic blanket in the unnerving silence of space. But they go further. Playlists are meticulously curated for missions. Soothing, familiar music is used to mark the evening period of their artificial day, a crucial ritual for maintaining circadian rhythms in a place where the sun rises and sets every 90 minutes. For parents who are astronauts, the act of singing a lullaby to their child back on Earth via video link becomes a profoundly emotional tether to gravity, to life, to home. The lullaby becomes a bridge across the vacuum, a tiny pocket of shared, warm humanity linking a parent in a cold metal can in orbit to a child in a bedroom, on the spinning blue marble below. But for our wonderfully quirky, fringe tidbit, we have to talk about the lullabies we've sent out as messages in bottles to the cosmos itself. The most famous example is aboard the Voyager Golden Record, a phonograph record attached to both Voyager spacecraft, now sailing through interstellar space, along with the sounds of whales, greetings in 55 languages, and the brainwaves of a woman in love. The record includes a lullaby, specifically, a Peruvian panpipe and drum recording of a wedding song, which was deemed to have the universal, soothing qualities of a lullaby. Think about that for a moment. As a representation of our species, we chose to include, among our greatest achievements, a song meant to soothe a child to sleep. It is a breathtakingly vulnerable act. We are telling the universe that we are a species that cares for its young, that we understand comfort, that we have a concept of tenderness that we consider so fundamental we broadcast it into the void. It is the lullaby as our ultimate cultural ambassador, carrying our most intimate, gentle sound to the stars. Historians and philosophers still argue whether the need for a lullaby in space signifies an indomitable human spirit, carrying our most comforting rituals with us no matter how far we go, or whether it highlights a terrifying, unbridgeable loneliness. Is playing a familiar song inside a spaceship a brave act of bringing home with you? Or is it a desperate, pathetic attempt to simulate a comfort that is irrecoverably millions of miles away? The lullaby, in the infinity of space, becomes a potent symbol of both our ambition and our fragility. We can engineer a vessel to break the bonds of gravity, but we cannot engineer ourselves out of the need for a simple, rhythmic comfort. The childish cry that once threatened to attract predators in the night now has no listener in the immense, empty silence. And yet, we sing anyway. We sing to maintain our sanity, to mark the time, to feel connected. The lullaby becomes the oldest and most human of technologies, proving that no matter how advanced we become, we still need to hum into the dark, if only to remind ourselves that we are still here. The stark, silent vacuum of space collapses inward, condensing into the soft, glowing screen of a smartphone. The infinite black is replaced by the intimate, electric blue light of a sleep-tracking app's interface, illuminating the face of a weary parent in the dark. The hum of a spaceship's life support becomes the nearly inaudible whir of a server farm, hundreds of miles away, processing data. You have returned to the modern nursery, but it has evolved once more. This is no longer the era of passive, corporate lullaby albums. This is the age of hyperpersonalization. The algorithm is no longer just a broadcaster. It is now the composer, the performer, and the nanny. The lullaby is being disassembled into raw data points and reassembled, in real time, into a unique sonic prescription designed for one child, and one child only. You are witnessing the final frontier of the lullaby, its total digitization. The mainstream historical fact here is the rise of the Internet of Things (IoT) and big data in parenting. We've moved far beyond simple white noise machines. Now, a suite of devices, smart monitors that track an infant's breathing, cryanalyzers that classify distress into categories: hunger, pain, fatigue, wearable sleep sensors that measure restlessness, feeds a constant stream of biometric data into the cloud. This data is the raw material for the new lullaby. An AI can analyze a child's unique sleep patterns, their heart rate variability, their stirrings and murmurs, and cross-reference it with a vast library of sonic information. It doesn't just play a lullaby, it generates one. It might determine that this specific child falls asleep 12.7% faster when a C# drone underpins a melody in 6/8 time, with a tempo of 67 BPM and the faint synthesized sound of a summer rainstorm, layered 18 decibels beneath it. The lullaby becomes a dynamic, responsive score to the child's own physiology, a perfect, closed feedback loop of sound and sleep. But for our wonderfully quirky, fringe tidbit, we have to look at the strange, uncanny valley these AI-composed lullabies can sometimes create. In its quest for the perfect, soothing algorithm, the AI might stumble upon combinations that are technically optimal, but deeply unsettling to a human listener. It might generate a melody that is harmonically perfect, but rhythmically alien, or use a synthetic voice that hits the exact frequency for relaxation, but has the flat, soulless cadence of a text-to-speech program reading a eulogy. There are online forums where parents share these bizarre, AI-generated lullabies, comparing the ones that sound like a robot trying to imitate a memory of a hug, or a satellite gently weeping. The AI, devoid of culture, context, or emotion, might decide that the most effective sound to induce sleep is not a melody at all, but the looping, pitch-shifted sound of a dishwasher's rinse cycle, because the data says it works. It's a world where the ancient, human-crafted weirdness of Rockabye Baby is replaced by a new, algorithmic weirdness that no folk tradition could ever have conceived. Historians and ethicists still argue whether this represents the ultimate democratization of care, giving every child, regardless of their parents' knowledge or energy, a perfectly tailored sleep soundtrack, or the final, complete outsourcing of parental intuition. What is lost when we stop trusting our own voice and instead trust the cloud? The algorithm doesn't know the story of your day. It doesn't know that the child skinned their knee and needs extra comfort. It doesn't understand the subtle difference between a fussy cry and a scared cry. It only understands data. The lullaby, once a dynamic, empathetic response to a child's immediate need, becomes a static, pre-programmed response to a data point. The parent becomes a system administrator, monitoring the app's output rather than their own child's cues. The intimate, messy, human transaction of soothing is sanitized and handed over to a machine that promises perfect efficiency, creating a generation that falls asleep to the sound of an algorithm's best guess at comfort. A flawless, data-rich, and utterly loveless hum. The cold, electric blue of the smartphone screen finally dims. Its algorithms having run their course, the synthesized, perfectly optimized hum fades into nothingness, leaving behind a silence that feels different now, deeper, more natural. The frantic chase for data, the relentless optimization, the hyper-personalized sonic prescriptions. It all recedes like a tide pulling back from the shore, and what it leaves behind is the simple, enduring truth, a human body, a quiet room, and the ancient, inexplicable magic of a melody. We've dissected the lullaby with every tool we have, from Freud's couch to fMRI machines, and yet, at its core, it remains a mystery, a beautiful, primal mystery. This is where we end, not with an answer, but with a question. Why, after all this time, does it still work? The mainstream historical, or rather, scientific fact we land on is the robust neurological evidence for the lullaby's power. Neuroscience has caught up to what intuition has always known. Studies show that listening to lullabies significantly lowers a child's heart rate, reduces cortisol levels, and increases oxygen saturation in the blood. Functional MRI scans reveal that familiar, soothing music can calm the amygdala, the brain's fear center, and engage the parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for rest and digestion. The repetitive, predictable patterns of a lullaby provide a cognitive framework that a developing brain can latch onto, a rhythmic anchor in the overwhelming storm of new sensory input. It's a biological hack. The slow tempo mirrors a resting heartbeat. The rising and falling contour of a typical melody subconsciously mimics the patterns of comforting pre-language vocalizations. The science is clear and compelling. The lullaby isn't just culture, it's physiology. It is quite literally music medicine. But for our final, wonderfully quirky, fringe tidbit, let's consider the singer, not the listener. The act of singing a lullaby has measurable, neurological benefits for the parent as well. The controlled, deep breathing required to sustain a melody activates the vagus nerve, which helps regulate stress. The focus on a repetitive, simple task is a form of mindfulness, pulling the parent out of their own anxious thoughts and into the present moment with their child. In a way, the lullaby is a two-way street of soothing. The parent's calm voice helps regulate the infant's nervous system, and the act of producing that calm voice helps regulate the parent's. It's a symbiotic, hormonal feedback loop of oxytocin and reduced stress, a shared biological ritual that benefits both parties. It's not just a song, it's a duet of biochemistry, a nightly tuning of two nervous systems to the same, peaceful frequency. Historians, anthropologists, and neuroscientists still argue Whether the lullaby's ultimate evolutionary purpose was to calm the child to avoid predators, to strengthen the parent-child bond, to ensure survival, or if it's simply a beautiful emergent property of our brains wiring a happy accident of consciousness. But perhaps the answer doesn't matter. Perhaps the magic is in the not knowing. After our long journey from Sumerian demon warnings to Egyptian dung charms, from Roman opium to Freudian analysis, from corporate algorithms to AI composers, we find ourselves right back where we started, in a quiet, dark room. A child fusses, and a parent, exhausted, frustrated, and overflowing with a love that is as terrifying as it is wonderful, opens their mouth, and they hum. It might be off-key, they might forget the words, they might just make it up as they go along. But the melody that emerges is the same one that has been emerging for thousands of years. It is a sound older than language, more powerful than any algorithm, and more comforting than any data point. It is the sound of love trying to shape itself into a blanket of sound, to tuck the most vulnerable thing in the world safely in against the vast, indifferent dark, and against all odds, against all the chaos and noise of history. It works. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into the final part of tonight's journey together. Let the weight of the day begin to dissolve, not because an algorithm told you to, but because your body remembers how. Feel the gentle rise and fall of your chest, a quiet rhythm that has been there all along, beneath the noise. There's no more history to learn tonight, no more facts to untangle, just the soft, welcoming silence at the edge of sleep. The journey we took through the centuries, it all funnels down to this single, quiet moment. All the fears, all the charms, all the science, it was all just a long, complicated way of trying to find this peace, to create a small pocket of safety in the dark. And you found it, you're here. The day is done. Your thoughts can soften now, blurring at the edges like a landscape seen through a misted window. There's nothing left to solve, nothing left to hold onto. Just the gentle, patient darkness, and the slow, steady rhythm of your own breath, carrying you away from the shores of wakefulness into the deep, quiet, and welcoming sea of sleep. Let everything go. You are safe. You are held. You can rest now.